Hello, welcome back to our series Securing Cyberspace. I'm Friederike, Editor-in-Chief of the Cloud Report, and of course, I'm joined by Julian, our security expert. Today, we start with a new topic. We want to talk about policies. In the area of secure cyberspace, we are meeting policies in different points, and we want to clarify what are policies and what is connected with this. And that's why we want to start with some definitions and related terms. But Julian, please start. What are policies?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you again for having me here and organizing all of this. So what are policies? So policies, as you already said, are a very important construct in the area of security, in particular when it comes to compliance, be this internal or external. But policies in itself, they are, as we can define policies, as nothing more and nothing less than just a statement of what is allowed and what is not allowed. However, in order to understand this a little bit better and in order to help define policies and then also enforce those policies, we need to introduce a couple of terms which sometimes are overlapped or interchanged and misunderstood and make this a little bit difficult to separate and to better understand. And I'll start with the first term, which is identification. So what means identification? So identification is the process of provisioning a unique identity and its characteristic properties, be this a subject or an object. So you provide an identity and provide characteristic properties of the identity. And with that, you are saying to a system that I am, for example, Bob or Alice in that moment. So you are pretending to be Bob or Alice at that moment while you are provisioning your identity. The next step after you have provisioned your identity is the authentication, which is the next process. And the authentication verifies whether the provisioned unique identity saying that you are Alice and you have blonde long hair, or you are Bob and you are 2 meters tall, is that this matches these characteristic properties. Yeah. In practice, we have, let's say, primary approaches on how actually we can do authentication. So how can we verify whether an identity that has been provisioned, it is what it pretends to be. So this is what authentication actually does. And primary approaches are usually knowledge, for example, username and password. So this is a unique username, and the password is the characteristic property of that username. And this is let's say, classified as a knowledge approach. So you know that you are the one knowing this, and that's why you can be, you are identifying yourself and you can be authenticated. Another one is ownership. For example, you own a specific smart card, a specific cryptographic key. So you own this, and that's why you can provide that unique identity, and by verifying the ownership, that you are the owner of that, you are authenticating, and it is verified that you are what you pretend to be. The next approach is biometry. So for example, your fingerprints, your eye retina, and your maybe voice recognitions. However, in the last decade, there are also, let's say, auxiliary approaches that have been developed, which are, for example, the combination of the first three, which we said, like the knowledge, the ownership, and biometry, which we call kind of the multi-factor authentication approaches. In addition to that, we have also spatial and time zones, meaning that with spatial, you are in a specific location, so you are actually identifying yourself from a specific location, and then you get authenticated if you are exactly on that location, which is, let's say, a specific characteristic or a time zone. So you are being either authenticated or not, or rejected authentication if you, for example, are in a different time zone. After being authenticated, meaning that the system knows who you are actually. So now we know that you are Elias, and now we know that you are Bob. So you said you are Bob, and we verified that, and now we know. So the system knows that it is Bob. So the next step is Bob tries to do something. So he tries, maybe, I don't know, he's hungry and wants to open the fridge and eat maybe ice cream. So, but in order to do so, we need to say to authorize Bob to open the fridge. So, and that is the next step. So which is called authorization, is verifying whether the subject, meaning Bob or Alice, which we just authenticated, and we know it is them, is entitled actually to access the object, is entitled to perform an action, right? And there's, when we say access, this is where access rights come into play. So this is the next term that I'd like to talk about, which is access rights. So what are access rights? So access rights are the permissions which a subject has, for example, Bob, to access a specific information or its representative, if we are talking in computer science. So we have an object and we have a representative of this object. So the access right is actually the interaction between the subject and the object, in which information flows and occurs between, information flow occurs between the subject and the object. Usually we have access, we say, we have read, write, or execute access. And in that case, if Bob wants to open the fridge to get an ice cream, he is going to eat it. At this stage, while authorization is concerned with the verification of the access rights, meaning whether the subject that it identified itself, we authenticated, and now we are authorizing to execute something, to do something, the question arises how and where we define these permissions. So how we define all this, and this is again, so I'm coming back to where I started, to the policies. So in order to all this, to make sense out of this and to say what is allowed and what is not allowed, to be compliant, be this internally or externally, we need policies. So we need the statement to say what actions are allowed and what are not allowed for which subject, and which actions may be allowed and which others may be not allowed for the specific subject. So there is where how all of this identification, authentication, authorization, access right, and permissions play a role into the policies, and where we define the policies, and how we define the policies. However, at this stage, again, another question arises, is actually how can we define and how can we enforce policies? At this stage is, so we want to define the policies, so we define the policies, nevertheless, we want to define the policies in a certain manner so that they can be actually also enforced. And this is where another term comes into play, which I want to introduce, where security mechanisms or security controls come into play, right? So a security mechanism and a control is a method or a tool or a procedure that can be technical or organizational for enforcing security policies. So this is how you enforce security policies. And a very simple example of it are the so-called discretionary access control, which you find on the operating system level. And discretionary access control means that in a sense, the subject actually with certain access and permission is capable of passing these permissions to any other subject of a specific object. So if it creates a file, it's the owner of the file, it can read, execute, and write to the file, but it can also pass these rights and these permissions to another subject. So this is why is it called discretionary access control. We also have another security control, for example, which is the mandatory access control, where we have a central place where we write the policies and we say what is allowed and what is not allowed. And this, now the user is not able anymore to do whatever they wish with objects they create, but the permissions are enforced. So let's say the policies that we have written, what is allowed and what is not allowed, are now enforced centrally by this system. And an example of mandatory access control is, again, we can take the example of the operating system level in Linux, is the so-called the security enhanced Linux, or SA Linux, which is an implementation of this access control and the security control in order to enforce the policies. I hope I could kind of clarify some of the terms, put them into relation, and how they actually belong to each other and how they play a role in each other. In the upcoming session, we will introduce and discuss what are actually challenges with respect to policy definition and enforcing. So what are the challenges to define policies and to enforce them, let's say, in a very heterogeneous and complex system and environment, as, for example, cloud computing. Yep.
Wow, that was a lot, starting from opening a fridge to organize a big and complex structure, IT structure. So yeah, thank you for the definitions, and I'm looking forward to learn more about policies and concrete examples.
Cool.
And the challenges. Thank you so much.
This next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.